Hello everyone, my name is Willow. I'm a history student at the University of Windsor, and today I will be discussing my research paper regarding interracial adoption in post-war Canada with a specific focus on the adoption of Black children into white families. Thank you to the Amherstburg Freedom Museum for allowing me to use their platform to speak about this relatively unknown aspect of Black Canadian history. So I'm briefly going to discuss previous scholarship regarding interracial adoptions in Canada. This is a relatively obscure area of interest in regard to Canadian history, not just in terms of interracial adoptions, but adoption history in general. In Canada, it is a topic that still requires further exploration. I found the work of Professor Karen Dubinsky from Queen's University particularly helpful for me in piecing together the history of the Open Door Society in Montreal and their initial efforts to get non-white children adopted. She has written extensively on interracial adoptions across the Americas and how babies, or what she calls the hybrid baby, can often symbolize changing social and political expectations. As well, Karen Balcom from McMaster University has researched the phenomenon of cross-border adoptions between the United States and Canada in the 20th century, and Veronica Strong-Bow from UBC has written extensively on the 60s scoop and adoption policy with a special focus on Indigenous children. Much of their work looks at the social, political, and cultural implications of interracial adoption in Canada. For my own research, I was interested in understanding the motivations of white families in adopting non-white children, and specifically Black children. So I chose to position my paper on addressing this question. So now I will go over the history of interracial adoptions in Canada and some of the various organizations and government agencies that partook in interracial adoption campaigns. Systems of adoption in Canada had long seen less desirable children left behind. This was especially true for children of certain ethnic minority groups, different religions, and children with disabilities. Previously, a successful placement depended on the agency finding the most suitable child to physically match the adoptive family. The goal was to seamlessly place a child into a family, so much so that few could tell that the child was not biologically related to the family. This saved parents from the embarrassment of telling the world that they may have had fertility issues or the shame of adopting a child in general. By 1960, unwanted children documented by the Children's Aid Societies, or CAS, in Toronto and Montreal consisted overwhelmingly of non-white children, and more specifically, Black and Indigenous children made up the majority of these hard-to-place cases. In response, a few prominent child welfare agencies began pushing the narrative of equal adoption, hoping to encourage Canadian families to adopt children of different backgrounds. So beginning in the late 1950s, several children's aid organizations attempted to increase the adoption rate of non-white children by utilizing interracial adoption campaigns from the Open Door Society. Arguably the instigators of what would later become an international adoption revolution. So the Open Door Society was founded in Montreal in 1959 by a small group of parents who had adopted Black or other non-white children. It started as a support group for these families and later morphed into an organization to promote interracial adoptions throughout Montreal. Of the members, the Edgar family was actually one of the first families in North America to legally adopt a non-white child in 1958. And on the screen, this article is from the Montreal Gazette in 1965, and it is a photo of the Edgar family. Following the lead of the ODS, Catholic Children's Aid Societies, along with Children's Aid Societies in Montreal and Toronto, began campaigns to encourage white families to consider adopting non-white children. And they did so by using early advocates and parents of non-white children as examples of success, and they attempted to reject the stigma around adoption in general, but specifically interracial adoption. This also led to the creation of the Committee for the Adoption of Negro Children in Toronto in 1962. While Canada was not the first country to allow for the adoption of non-white children into white families, it was the first to pioneer legislation regarding the issue and to encourage Canadian families to consider the adoption of undesirable children. The Open Door Society really spearheaded what would become a decade-long sustained campaign to destigmatize interracial adoptions, and this really resulted in a greater conversation amongst many Canadians regarding race and whether race played a role in family cohesion and even social cohesion more broadly. And this was demonstrated in some of the articles from newspapers across Canada throughout the 1960s. Campaigns by the Open Door Society took a variety of forms, including newspaper articles, advertisements, public forums, and television specials. This image was taken from a CBC broadcast in 1960. The show was called Tabloid, and this special was entitled The Children Nobody Wants. The show interviewed two couples from Montreal, and here we can observe some of the motivations behind adopting Black and non-white children. These parents tended to be well educated. Approximately 70% of these parents had post-secondary educations. They were strong in their convictions as to not be easily swayed by public criticism, and their motivations ranged from wanting to help less fortunate children in the system to wanting to adopt a child closer in age to their own children, and this left them with few choices other than undesirable or unadoptable children. And I suspect in many cases the latter was true, as many parents were not initially interested in adopting Black or non-white children until they were either asked by CAS workers or had come across ODS advertisements. So here I made a collage of some of the news titles I came across in my research relating to interracial adoption in Canada. Some of them are from the United States, but there were tons of articles ranging from 1959 all the way to 1975 across Canada in almost every major newspaper. And this slide demonstrates what some of the full-page articles looked like. I was actually surprised by how many newspapers dedicated full pages in multiple issues to interracial adoption. These two are from the Montreal Gazette in 1962 and the Ottawa Citizen in 1964. And clearly the objective here is to tug at the heartstrings of prospective parents. As you can see with some of these titles, like right here, Kevin, his prayers for parents not answered, and Gail, smiles do not come easily. So I'll quickly speak on the response of the government to the issue of interracial placements. In response to ODS lobbying, the Government of Canada aided in the exposure of unwanted children and attempted to increase public awareness about the possibilities of adopting outside of one's race. The government of Ontario was particularly prudent in creating and supporting legislation that would see an increase in interracial and interfaith adoptions. The government played a crucial role in the procedural changes within the branch of the Department of Public Welfare that oversaw adoptions, and also in expediting adoption exchanges, which would allow children to be adopted across municipalities where there might be families that were more willing to adopt Black or non-white children. And this was especially true in the Atlantic provinces, where it was sometimes difficult to get Black children adopted, and in the Prairie provinces, where it was often difficult to get Indigenous children adopted. So it was necessary at times to move these children around to facilitate a successful placement for them. And on the left-hand side of the screen here, I found an article, a newspaper article from the Windsor Star in 1967, which demonstrates this quite clearly, where there were some Black children from the Windsor-Essex area that were adopted out to other parts of the province, and in some cases across the border to Michigan. So by the mid-1960s, word of the ODS's work began to see public support in almost every major newspaper and in magazines across North America. The Globe and Mail described it as a revolution taking place in the courts, homes, and children's aid societies of Ontario. As government legislation and public awareness campaigns were launched to bring attention to the needs of non-white or mixed race children whose numbers were increasing each year across the country. As a result, the Social Planning Council of Metropolitan Toronto sustained a 3-year campaign seeking to break down barriers in relation to the adoption of Black children, specifically in Canada, between 1963 and 1965. And as recorded by the Metropolitan Toronto Children's Aid Society in 1964, adoptions across the board had risen just over 7% from the previous year, with the Toronto CAS placing 22 Negro or part Negro children into white families, and the Catholic CAS in Toronto placing 6 in white families for the first time in their history. The Montreal Children's Service Centre noted that non-white and mixed race adoptions rose from 8 in 1958 to approximately 30 per year between 1960 and 1963. This rise in adoptions wasn't just in relation to Black and non-white children. This was true for adoptions in Canada across the board. Ontario experienced a dramatic increase in adoption rates between 1965 and 1966, and this was also the case in Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, and in Newfoundland. Experts ascribed the increase in interest in interracial adoptions to broadening public attitudes and efforts by agencies to tell the public about different types of adoptions and adoptable children. So this was a really interesting part of my research. The response by Americans to Canada's successful campaigning on the behalf of Black and other minority children was complex, to say the least. Many American children's aid organizations were impressed with the success of the ODS's campaigns and the rapid increases in adoption rates across Canada. So much so that by the mid-1960s, American organizations began adopting Canadian campaign strategies, and by 1966, the state of New York had implemented similar systems of adoption, seeing an increase of 75% in mixed race and interracial adoptions. Even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. commented on Canada's new adoption policies as being far ahead of the times. However, the actual legal adoption of Black children in the United States was complicated by segregation and racial prejudice. For instance, I found a few articles relating to this. In 1961, a couple in Rutland, Virginia were denied by the court in their efforts to adopt a 5-year-old Black girl. The court argued that they could not support her placement as the adoption, quote, would necessitate listing the Negro child's parents as white, end quote, on her birth certificate, which would have been seen at that time as completely inappropriate and nonsensical within the legal system of segregation. The following year, another white couple in Carlstadt, New Jersey, were denied the adoption of a 6-year-old Black boy who they actually knew personally due to their neighbors objecting to his presence, as it would, quote, ruin the property value, end quote. So, what were the major motivations for Canadians considering interracial adoption? During this period, Canada experienced a shift toward a more radical form of nationalism, as described by historian Stephen Azzi, and Canadians began to position themselves as the antithesis of their American counterparts, something that I think we can argue that many Canadians still subscribe to, both politically and culturally. Canadians were becoming acutely aware of racial issues unfolding globally, and many wanted to push back against systemic discriminatory practices in the United States and in South Africa. Whether directly or indirectly, through these interracial adoption programs, Black children in turn served as a visual representation of Canada's progress, liberalism, and hope for racial integration and acceptance. And here I found these through the Toronto Public Library. So 300 members of Toronto's clergy marched down Queen Street in support of Martin Luther King's civil rights movement in 1965, and in June of 1976, demonstrators in Toronto protested outside of the CIBC's head office over the bank's decision to continue its loaning program with South Africa, and Canada would later impose economic sanctions on South Africa in 1985. As argued by Karen Dubinsky, some saw interracial adoption as a possible solution to combating racist sentiments, with these children serving as a sign of cross-racial tolerance and an example of the growing progressive values held by many Canadians. Utilizing these new adoption policies, Canadians were able to reinforce long-standing beliefs that Canada was a beacon of liberalism and racial tolerance. Initially, Black organizations and community leaders in Canada praised the work of the ODS and other CAS societies and organizations for their work in breaking down barriers. The ODS worked closely with Montreal's Black community and Black children's aid organizations to create educational programs and to facilitate community awareness. However, there was pushback from the Black community, especially in the United States. Pushback came from an American organization called the National Association of Black Social Workers in 1972, who argued that Black children should be placed with Black families in order to maintain a physical, psychological, and cultural connection to their identity. As well, the organization stated, quote, "We denounce the assertions that Blacks will not adopt. We affirm the fact that Black people, in large numbers, cannot maneuver the obstacle course of the traditional adoption process," end quote. And this was a particularly important question for the Black community here in Canada. why were there so few Black families willing to adopt? Part of the problem was that the Black population in Canada was relatively small. So even though the number of Black children in care facilities across the country was only a few hundred, there just were not enough Black families capable of adopting all of these children. As well, similar to what the NABSW expressed, many Black Canadians would have found it difficult to maneuver through the adoption process, often due to financial limitations, and many didn't feel welcome to participate. This left many Black Canadians wondering how much of this program was self-serving. Were the adoptions being popularized across the country solely for the appearance of taking the moral high ground, or was this really about the needs of these children? I think to answer that question, we have to understand where this pushback is coming from, and we have to take a broader look at the presence of Black Canadians in the changing Canadian landscape of the 1960s. Racial discrimination was certainly present and remained an issue in Canada. Interracial adoption was an important first step, but it didn't negate the discrimination felt by the majority of the Black population. As the civil rights movement gave way to more radical forms of Black thought and consciousness, Canadians were faced with a more aggressive, less apologetic form of Black protest. An example of this was the Sir George Williams University riot in 1969, when 6 Black biology students accused their professor of racial discrimination, and the university failed to address the accusations accordingly. As a result, over 100 students barricaded themselves in the school's data center, what we would call today a computer lab, for almost 10 hours, and a fire ensued. Damages were estimated at over $2 million, and dozens of students were arrested. While many Canadians expressed empathy toward the students due to the discrimination they had faced, it was clear that the Canadian public was not on board with the more radical forms of protest characterized by the Black Power movement in the United States. And when faced with this sort of protest, Canadians were generally uneasy with this form of expression. This bled into the issue of interracial adoptions, as some Black activists and members of the Black community began to perceive this as a new form of assimilation in a country with a distinct colonial past. At the same time, Montreal was a hotbed for Black Power activism in Canada, with high-profile revolutionaries like Stokely Carmichael, who actually visited Montreal multiple times, and this image here shows him speaking at the Black Writers' Conference in 1968. As well, we had homegrown activists, most notably Burnley Rocky Jones, who was active as a student protester. He participated in Black Power activism, and later he became a lawyer and directed his activism toward Canada's legal system. And as you can see here in the Dalhousie Gazette, he was often coined as Canada's version of Stokely Carmichael. Of course, we can't talk about racial discrimination and interracial adoption in Canada without discussing the failure of Indigenous adoptions and the 60s Scoop, and how this relates to the overall campaign for interracial adoptions in Canada. Indigenous adoptions were very different from Black adoptions during this period. In most cases, Black children fell into the custody of CAS organizations or became wards of the state through their mothers illegally putting them up for adoption, whereas overwhelmingly Indigenous children were placed in care facilities as a result of CAS workers coming into the home and making the decision that the child would be better off in foster care. And often this wasn't the case. They, had some had ulterior motives, and this only fueled the belief that Indigenous children were being kidnapped, as they had been in many cases with residential schools. The numbers that we're talking about as well were different. There were thousands of Indigenous children up for adoption, and in some ways, their presence across the country was seen as a far greater problem for the nation than the few hundred Black children scattered across the country. This led the intentions behind these adoptions to differ, with parents of Black children wanting to provide loving homes for forgotten children in most cases, whereas with Indigenous kids there was always an underlying current of needing to assimilate them, and in order to do this successfully, the child had to be completely removed from their language, culture, religion, and of course from their people. With many Black adoptees, their adopted parents understood that they still needed some connection to their roots, and in this case, the ODS had a number of Black history Saturday schools and programs for not only the Black children who had been adopted, but also for their parents and their siblings. As a result, in most cases, families who had adopted Black children had a much higher success rate when compared to Indigenous children in interracial placements. So finally, what does this tell us about post-war Canadians in relation to race and moral identity? I would argue that interracial adoptions were a result of and an influence for changing perceptions regarding race and diversity within Canadian society, as interracial adoptions served as a powerful visual social message. While these families may have experienced abuse for their decision to adopt a Black or non-white child, the general atmosphere within Canadian society greatly valued the adoption of these children into loving homes, regardless of their ethnicity. Many Canadians believed that they could be examples of integration and racial acceptance through interracial adoption, or at least the support of these campaigns. And I would also argue that in most of these cases, parents were not concerned with optics or demonstrating their political or social beliefs regarding race. They simply wanted to adopt a child in need, and were not hung up on aspects of ethnic background. Most Canadians were well-intentioned, but this intense focus on Canadian morality and racial tolerance resulted in the dismissal of Canada's own issues with race and racism, and the undercurrents of colonialism in relation to these interracial adoptions, especially with Indigenous children. Many people saw interracial adoptions as a form of racial solidarity, but some Black and many Indigenous people perceived it as a new form of colonialism, in a sense, the colonization of the traditional Black or Indigenous family unit. And that is the end of the presentation. So I will take a look and see if there are any comments. Sorry, I'm just reading the comments. Okay, just in response to Angela, you're not alone. There are a lot of people who don't really know very much about this topic, even people who lived through it. It was something that was heavily campaigned, but in many ways, if you weren't looking for it or if you weren't interested in adoption, it might not have been something that really stood out to you. It might have just been something you, briefly took a look at in a newspaper or a magazine. But there are a lot of children, especially Indigenous children, who went through these sorts of interracial adoptions, and there are also a significant number of Black children as well. Let me see. Okay, just in response to Dr. Wright, I would argue that it certainly was a factor during this period, especially for Indigenous children. I came across this more in the history of Indigenous children being adopted into white families. The government really was trying to step back from not just childcare but also adoption in general in some of these cases, and so they left a lot of the work up to these individual organizations, and often the organizations really only communicated with the provincial governments, and so there were a lot of kids who needed placements, and they tried whatever they could to try and get some of these kids into homes and to basically have them not be problems of the government. So I didn't come across many instances of where Canadians were resistant to the adoption of Black children, other than certain Black organizations and certain activists. They were, in some cases, vocal about their disdain for these sorts of programs. But in terms of the courts, Canada not only didn't have a problem with placing Black children in white families, they opened up a lot of the legal requirements, letting not just children of different ethnicities be adopted by white parents, but they also opened up requirements for faith. So that was actually quite a big issue as well. The courts basically said it doesn't really make a lot of sense that we're stopping a child from having a loving home just because the child was born to Catholic parents and the parents trying to adopt them are Protestant. So Canada really didn't have too much of a pushback legally or in the courts. And in general, the Canadian public either thought it was a nice idea or they weren't really interested in it or weren't really worried about it. Yeah, I'm not sure what the percentage of Black children adopted from Canada. I'm not sure if this is currently or in the past, but there weren't that many children who were listed as Black or half Black in care during the 1960s and 70s. Probably at the most maybe a few hundred at a time across Canada. So it was easier placing them in families because there wasn't a huge number of them once interracial adoptions were approved by the government, and once people started to become aware that it was possible to adopt a non-white child into a white family. So I think part of the problem is that there are a lot of people who don't actually know anything about this history. So to say whether or not it's seen as being successful today, that's sort of difficult to touch on. I think if you were to talk to a lot of Black organizations, they may make the argument that while it was good to place these children into families that could care for them, it would have been better if the government had first tried to place these children into Black families first. But I think most people understand in that period of time as well as today that a lot of these children, if they aren't adopted relatively soon in their childhood, they're going to have a very hard time finding placements, and it only becomes harder for the child to adapt. So it's always better for a child to grow up in a loving family, regardless of whether or not it's in a white family or Black family or any other sort of family.